For those of you that don't know me, my name is Pastor Noelle, and I serve as pastor of spiritual formation. We are continuing in our series, People of Welcome, where we are looking at what it means to be a people of welcome and how that is modeled by the life of Jesus and in Scripture. And so I'm going to read our sermon text today, which is found in Luke chapter 14, verses 12 through 14. I will ask you to stand if you're able, if you can, just because we like to honor the Gospels as just the written, revealed life of Jesus, and so we like to honor that through standing. So Luke 14, 12 through 14 says this. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The word of the Lord. All right, you may be seated. Scripture consistently reveals God's extending radical welcome and inclusion despite our rejection and unfaithfulness. God always invites us into his mission of reconciliation, which is rooted in welcome. So in a culture of individualism and exclusion, how can we live as people of welcome? So this is the question, the thought that we have been exploring together this summer. And this week we are talking about welcome that expects nothing. So from the passage that we looked at today is also a sermon passage that we've looked at recently in regards to welcome, because Jesus has a lot to say about dinner parties, interestingly enough, which we appreciate, because who doesn't love a good dinner party, you know? But oftentimes in the culture that Jesus is speaking into, parties and dinners were this means of social hierarchy, right? And forward progress. And this concept really isn't that far off in our own culture. I mean, there's a lot of social gatherings that provide opportunity for upward mobility or networking or connections to advance a career. And I was thinking about, this is not my life, but I have a lot of friends in fundraising, and a lot of their weekends are filled going to parties to try to meet people to get money from them, which sounds like a terrible career for me, but I'm sure there's people that are great at it and it's needed, and a lot of nonprofits are very lucky to have those people on their staff. But this concept is not inherently bad. I mean, the social networking and all of that stuff is not inherently bad. But I think what Jesus, and honestly the prophets in the Old Testament and Scripture as a whole, are calling us to is to care about the status of those who are not welcome rather than our own status. And that also likely means we won't have any kind of reciprocity for our own gain. So in this passage, Jesus is not saying we can't invite our friends to a dinner party, for the record. But the word that's used here likely indicates a habitual asking. So instead of saying don't invite, Jesus is likely implying don't just continually invite, or don't just exclusively invite those who love you. I think Jesus is trying to get to this underlying motivation of why we do what we do, or why we invite who we invite, or why we engage who we engage. Jesus and the Old Testament prophets continually remind us that we have a responsibility to the poor and the disenfranchised. I've been finding myself continually more and more just convicted about this and how I see people and how I engage. It's really easy for me to think about my own comfort, whether that's finances or social anxiety or whatever it might be. It's super easy for me to start with my place of comfort. But I think one of the ways that we resemble the life of Jesus is through offering a kind of welcome that's radically selfless, a kind of generosity that's radically selfless. And we've talked a lot over recent years about the quartet of the vulnerable, which is often referred to by the prophets in the Old Testament: the foreigner, the orphan, the widow, and the poor. And Jesus often references a similar quartet, but here he names the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Both are indicating the forgotten, right, or those who are considered less than, those who are stigmatized because of their condition or position. Ultimately, though, all of these groups are defined by their lack. Their lack of resources, lack of support, lack of wholeness. And Jesus tells us to welcome and include those who are lacking. That also inevitably means they can't do anything for us in return. This idea is beautifully illustrated by John, chapter 15:13, where it says, "There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends." The ultimate sacrifice that cannot be returned to us is the kind of sacrificial love that gives all we have and requires nothing in return. And we tend to be naturally self-seeking people, creatures. Not that God intended it that way, of course, but one of the ways that sin has manifested itself in humanity is this constant seeking of what we want. And I think this is illustrated really well in children. Not that children are amazing. I love kids. That sounds really bad when I say it off the bat. But in the sense that I think about when I'm playing with my nieces, and the refrain I hear over and over again is more, whatever it is we're doing. It's like they're not satisfied because they want more, which is great. And I only can get there's only so many times you can throw a child in the pool before you just need a break, you know? But they're focused on what they want. They don't care. Or the other day at our larger-than-life game night, I was helping a couple of really cute children with their mom put up bowling pins repeatedly for I don't even know how long. And it was a great time, but those children did not care about our back pain. They did not care about about anything else that was going on, except that they wanted their turn to bowl, which I love that about them. That's great. I love that about them. But what's the point? It's not a critique of children, but an acknowledgement that we in our humanity are just bent toward achieving what we want. We naturally seek out things that benefit us. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we need to survive and provide for our families. So I'm not trying to demonize the concept of provision. But how often does our desire to seek the things that benefit us blind us from seeking the things that benefit the kingdom more? Because I think often that becomes the priority rather than just trusting that God will provide for us too. And I think that Jesus demonstrates to us that one of the ways we do that is by giving and welcoming without expectation. Discipleship and life in the Spirit, aka sanctification, is the process of Jesus re-nurturing our deepest selves into people who are no longer dictated by the mindset of self-preservation or scarcity. What stops us from welcoming and giving without fear? Probably a lot of things, but I think the underlying belief that we'll be lacking something. But if your Father owns everything, then what is there to fear? So the shift is then from being concerned about our own lack to instead being concerned about what others are lacking. As our confidence and trust in the Lord grows, we are able to let go of that fear. Our fear over our own lack, our fear over our own self-preservation. Giving in order to get is a form of control. It's calculated for the sake of a return. And so maybe Jesus is saying here, don't control your welcome. Let your welcome be so out of control that no one is off limits. Though maybe the Lord wants to address the root of our very nature of self-preservation and reminding us that he is actually in control and that because of his provision, we can be radically generous with our invitations without worrying what will or won't come back to us. I want to read for us 2 Samuel chapter 9, which you probably weren't expecting, so I'm happy to include the Old Testament every time I can. But this is a story about David and a guy called Mephi. We're going to call him Mephi, because every time I try to say it, I butcher it. And I have to say his name like 20 times today. So we're going to call him Mephi, but you can look at 2 Samuel chapter 9 to appropriately read his name, okay? So I'm going to read this chapter for us. You're welcome to turn there as well. One day David asked, "Is anyone in Saul's family still alive?" anyone to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" He summoned a man named Ziba, who had been one of Saul's servants. "Are you Ziba?" the king asked. "Yes, sir, I am," Ziba replied. The king then asked him, "Is anyone still alive from Saul's family? If so, I want to show God's kindness to them." Ziba replied, "Yes, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive. He is crippled in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. "In Lo-debar," Ziba told him, "the home of Machir, son of Ammiel." So David sent for him and brought him from Machir's home. His name was Mephi. He was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. When he came to David, he bowed low to the ground in deep respect. David said, "Greetings, Mephi." And then Mephi replied, "I am your servant." "Don't be afraid," David said. "I intend to show kindness to you because of my promise to your father Jonathan. I will give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table." Mephi bowed respectfully and exclaimed, "Who is your servant that you should show such kindness to a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and servants are to farm the land for him to produce food for your master's household. But Mephi, your master's grandson, will eat here at my table." Ziba replied, "Yes, my lord the king, I am your servant, and I will do all that you have commanded." And from that time on, Mephi ate regularly at David's table, like one of the king's own sons. And Mephi had a young son named Micah, and from then on, all the members of Ziba's household were Mephi's servants. And Mephi, who was crippled in both feet, lived in Jerusalem and ate regularly at the king's table. The word of the Lord. So the scene is this: David has become king over Israel and established his kingdom after Saul, and it would have been standard practice for a king to kill any remaining relatives of the former king's family. And that would be to prevent some heir from trying to take the throne at a future date. And so Mephi was Saul's grandson and Jonathan's son. And David here does the exact opposite of what would have been culturally appropriate. He deliberately seeks out the remaining relatives of Saul to specifically show kindness, is what Scripture said. Just like God has sought us out to show kindness, right? But this is also an interesting situation because we actually know why Mephi is crippled in both feet. Because in 2 Samuel chapter 4, he was described as being a child around 5 years old. And when the news about Jonathan and Saul's death comes about, his nurse picks him up to run and drops him, and it says he becomes crippled in both feet. So it was likely the fear that his family would be killed because of David's taking the throne that he was crippled in the first place. And he was residing at this place called Lo-debar, which means a place of no pasture. So the name indicates this kind of isolation and scarcity that he was living in. And not only this, but he resides in the house of Machir, meaning he doesn't have his own house or property. This could also indicate, his poverty and lack of status, but additionally that he probably was in hiding his whole life. Everything about his life has been defined by shame. In fact, the name Mephibosheth means, that's why we call him Mephi, means to be shamed, or from the mouth of shame. So everything about his life has been defined by shame. And his own crippling was the result of his grandfather's reign. His status in being someone related to the former king and as one who is physically disabled brought shame to him as well. And again, he's physically in hiding, cannot provide likely an income or a living for his family. There's nothing he can offer to anybody, let alone the king of Israel. So when David seeks him out, he likely anticipated that he was going to be killed. But instead of destroying his enemy, quote unquote, David honors him and goes against what the culture said he should do. Our welcome of others includes those who would normally not be welcomed, even our enemies. David's kindness towards him is purely out of love and out of the covenant he made with Jonathan. Jonathan, who was Saul's son, was one of David's best friends. And in 1 Samuel chapter 20, Jonathan and David make a covenant together where Jonathan asks him to show unfailing kindness to his family and descendants. Ultimately, this chapter highlights the fulfillment of that covenant. David seeks out Mephi to provide kindness. And then he says that he will always be part of the king's table. This means that he's given status akin to one of the king's sons. And at the end of this chapter, it literally says he ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. We're told that then he resides in Jerusalem with David so that he can continually sit at the king's table. And not only that, but David ensures that Mephi and his family will always be taken care of. He's talking about servants and land and income. His entire life was changed by a welcome that expected nothing in return. He went from living in hiding with nothing to living in the royal city at the king's table, having continued resources and income. Now, there's a lot of parallels between this story and the gospel. God, in his kindness, seeks us out to show mercy to us, invites us to his kingdom with a lavish welcome, and covers our shame with his goodness. All of Mephi's shame was covered by David's kindness. David made a covenant with Jonathan to show steadfast love to any member of Jonathan's household, just like God has made a covenant with us. When we become people who extend welcome without expectation, we can also help to undo the shame and loneliness of others, just as we have experienced in Jesus. Our kindness and welcome and compassion can quite literally help to destigmatize the shame that others are experiencing. Recently, as a small example of this, I've been working really hard to feel and experience my own emotions. Which is not something that's easy for me. I'm not really good at being vulnerable. I hate crying. And I often find myself feeling a lot of shame when it comes to sadness and my emotions in general. But in these last few months, in trying to be more open and processing, I've had a lot of really good friends, particularly Susan, who have reminded me over and over again that my emotions are welcome and seen and deserving of space. And those moments of having my whole self welcomed are helping to slowly and incrementally undo that shame. So there's power that our welcome can have. David and Mephi are the beautiful example, an analogy of God and humanity, and hopefully also of us and how we can extend welcome to others. We all are and have been Mephibosheth. We have been welcomed to God's table. Our shame has been covered and our position has been secured. Because we have been him, we can then know how to respond as David did. In this story, we have the opportunity to recognize ourselves in both parts. Our experience of welcome hopefully then galvanizes us to do the same for others. And I also want to point out that when we welcome without expectation, it stops us from seeing people as projects, or it should. Because when I welcome and I care for somebody without expectation, there's not a pressure I need to put on them to respond in a particular way. People know when they're a project, and people know when they're being loved. And when we are free of any expectations, we're free to just see people as they are and to love them as they are. Welcome can turn enemies into family, can cover shame, and can quite literally change lives. This is the kind of power that our welcome, our hospitality, our generosity can have on the world around us. And if you're here today experiencing shame or feeling forgotten or lonely or hidden, you aren't defined by any of those things. You are seen by the King, and he invites you to be his child, to sit at this very table with him. Your weaknesses don't disqualify you from that. And if you're a child of the King who's over everything, then you don't have to live in scarcity or self-preservation. You can live with the knowledge that you're abundantly cared for and can then invite others into that same welcome.